It is both my personal pleasure and a considerable privilege to welcome you all today to Lowther Lodge, the home of the Royal Geographical Society, of which Peter was a fellow for almost 80 years of his long life. I was asked by Peter's family to arrange this celebration of his life and work in the place in which he was probably the most comfortable, and in which he spent so much of both his early and later years as a geographer. Indeed, in the adjacent room, one you passed at the head of the stairs on your left, was the old map room, now styled the old map room. And it was there that he first became acquainted with the Society's map collection as a schoolboy at nearby Latimer Higher School. And in this very room, in fact, which in his day was styled the map room, we now refer to it as the old new map room, because the map room now is downstairs. And he saw out the later years of his career in this room as keeper of the Society's map collection. In between those two stints, he will, and you will shortly hear much more about this, was his career in the Ministry of Defence, originally the War Office, when he joined in 1950. And it provided him with the pathway which, looking back, he was probably uniquely qualified to tread in the latter half of the 20th century, in laying the foundations which helped shape and influence the nation's mapping collections, geography as a profession, and encouraging the careers of so many of us here today. He was indeed guide, mentor, and friend in many different guises at many different times. I want to register our collective thanks initially to the Director of the Royal Geographical Society, Joe Smith, to the President of the British Cartographic Society, Seppi Casatari, and to the Chair of the Charles Close Society, Jerry Zierler, for their generous support to this occasion, which has allowed us to hold the event at no cost to attendees. My thanks are due also to Liz Bourne, the BCS Administrator, who has run the registration process so effectively for us and who sadly had to withdraw from attending the event at very short notice because of COVID concerns in her family. Particular thanks today I extend to Ian Spencer, Director of the Defence Geographic Centre, and the team of young geographers who would be the people you've seen at the desk as you came in, that he's brought with him and organising us all to very good effect so far. And I particularly want to register my personal thanks to 4 people who have helped me behind the scenes with advice and support over the last few months. I warmly thank them because they have been absolute pillars for me personally. Jo Hodgson, Sarah Tyack, Rita Gardner, and Catherine Souch. Thanks to them particularly. I want to thank the presenters, each of whom stepped forward immediately when approached by me to participate. They made my job very straightforward. And finally, I want to thank you all for your attendance today. In our number are many of Peter's family, members of Ian Mumford's family, members of Ken Schickel's family, and an array of Peter's former colleagues and friends from across the British national mapping community. During the short refreshment break, I hope you will have the opportunity, as you've already started to do, to exchange stories and experiences about the man for whom all who worked with him had enormous respect and retained very fond memories. Each of our presenters will share with us a different aspect of the multifaceted life and work of this quiet giant of the geographical world. And I now invite all our presenters to address us in the order listed in the programme and to share their recollections. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to meet old friends here and to be invited in particular to say a few words on Peter and the Royal Geographical Society. I warmly thank Barbara for the opportunity to do so and congratulate her on behalf of all of us for organising this event. I also thank the many people who have helped me with their recollections, with some research, with their information, in piecing together this short presentation. And in particular, I would like to thank Yo Hodson in her research on Peter's early years for her wonderful eulogy. And Yo, thank you so much. It could be said that Peter both commenced and ended his formal career at the Society. And if that's stretching the truth just a little, it's fair to say that the Society and its collections was a constant thread and source of inspiration and enjoyment for almost his entire life. A geographer through and through, his passion was stirred, like I suspect many of us here, by a young inspirational geography teacher. In his case, it was by Eric Brio at Latimer Upper School, where he was a scholarship boy. While still there in his mid-teens, he discovered and fell in love with the RGS and its map room. And in 1945, at the age of 18, he became a fellow. You could do that in those days. A 21st birthday present was Life Fellowship of the Society. And for most of the 74 years that he was a Life Fellow, I'm sure he would have known very well that he was a financial cost to the Society. Peter did, however, give so much more back to the Society in many other ways. This culminated in the final 8 years of his salaried career, when he brought his immense knowledge, his passion for all things mapping, his contact networks, and above all, his warmth and humanity directly to bear on the RGS. Oh, I think this is probably going to go, no, let's go back one. Yes, okay. He took up the appointment of Curator of Maps on the 4th of January 1984 after retiring from the MOD, taking over from Mr. Bilcliffe. He worked closely with his bosses, first Brigadier Hardy and then Brigadier Gathercole, as successive keepers of the map room here, responsible for the Society's entire collections. As a young female postgraduate, researcher from Oxford in the late 1970s, not long before Peter started, my encounters at the time with the RGS map room had been somewhat difficult, with permission being sharply refused to copy any of the maps I needed for my research in South India. This may well not have been everybody's experience, I acknowledge, but Cambridge University Map Library readily obliged at no cost. And when Peter was promoted to Keeper of the Map Room in the early 1989, on the retirement of Brigadier Gathercole, he ushered in a more enlightened and more welcoming ethos into the map room, and one that has supported many researchers in his time and over the years since. He was always willing to share his knowledge, to make connections for people, and to inspire them. He was supported here by David Wileman and then Jane Dunlop as librarian, and we welcome Jane amongst us today. Francis Herbert as Curator of Maps, and I think Francis is, yes, he's right at the back, hello Francis. Ted Hatch as draftsman and other paid and volunteer staff. They made up the single largest department in the RGS then. In this role, Peter was responsible for the entire collections of the Society, including maps, books, journals, artifacts, and the manuscript and photographic archives. It was and remains one of the greatest geographical collections of exploration and early geographical research. And in the year 2000, the collections totaled an estimated 2 million items. Peter was one of the few graduate geographers on the Society's staff at that time. And it was a real pleasure, in my role as editor of the Geographical Journal, to sit in the journal office on the back stairs and talk geography and the RGS with him. Always ready, with a welcoming smile and his personal enthusiasm. It's little wonder that staff members such as Jane Dunlop recollect warmly on the support and the encouragement Peter gave to them and their careers, and on his approachability. Jane adds, I quote, "He was at the stage of his career where he had plenty of interest left in his subject, but was not looking for career advancement, just the ability to work with maps." Peter's professional networks and the high respect in which he was held both in the MOD and in the cartographic community more widely was of great benefit to the RGS and to geography in a number of ways. Very many of his staff in the MOD and indeed wider contacts were encouraged to become Society Fellows. Many, and many here, have become long-standing fellows and supporters of the Society's collections, its work to advance geography, and to recognise a geographical profession with the Chartered Geographer accreditation. A number of you have played active roles in the Society, including as honorary secretaries, I notice Roy Wood is with us, Sea Geog assessors, and some have also become members of the Geographical Club, the dining club closely linked to the Society at Peter's nomination. Peter himself was elected to the club in 1976 and last attended one of the club's very convivial dinners in autumn 2002. His contact networks and those of Francis Herbert were invaluable in keeping the Society well positioned within the wider mapping community and its national and international institutions and societies. We'll hear much more about those as this afternoon progresses. His contact networks, his connectedness to the community, and his love of maps also led to a rich resource of maps, finding their way to the RGS. Donated maps, rescued maps, Ordnance Survey maps, MOD maps, Admiralty charts, and many more, and ultimately once accessioned and catalogued into its map collections during his years as map curator and keeper. Peter was not a man for throwing things away or refusing a donation. And he was active in ensuring regular donations were received from the mapping and charting institutions nationally and internationally. This has always been the main way in which this society has built its renowned map collections, as Peter indeed himself set out in his engaging paper on the history of the Society's map collection in The Map Curator in June 1986. Donations from fellows were not sometimes without their hazards. For example, on one occasion when the collections team cleared a deceased fellow's premises, they discovered on sorting through the material that the man had acquired a number of valuable books from the Salmagundi Club in New York. The club director considered the returned books so valuable that he paid a personal visit to Peter and the RGS team to thank them. There were other examples of this nature too. Most donations were, however, from institutions and agencies. In 1987, for example, the Society records a mention by the mapping and charting establishment of the MOD of an extensive collection of plans, reports and studies relating to World War II, work carried out largely by geographers. In the presidential address of that year, Sir George Bishop noted, and I quote, "In many ways, the Society's greatest contribution to geographical research is through its collections of maps, books, pictures, and photographs. They occupy a large part of the Society's house and engage the majority of our staff. Almost 5,000 charts, maps, and atlases were added to our collection of about 750,000 items during the past year." No wonder it was a big staff team involved in the collections. And that was from the Geographical Journal of November 1987. So many maps that at times they were difficult to accommodate. And as we found in 2002, when we came to create the Foyle Reading Room as a new, publicly accessible home for all the collections, their consultation and display. And that, most of you will know, is now downstairs in the basement. It's a wonderful coincidence, as Barbara has already noted, that this celebration is being held in the former map room. And the clue is in the frieze that you see around this room and the frieze that you see in the photograph in front of you. Now the Education Centre of the Society, a room that changed little from 1960 to 1995, the left and right-hand photographs. It was a characterful space that many of you will remember, and one personally I rarely recall as being quite as tidy as those images show. So at times it was even more characterful. Since 2004, this room has regularly welcomed thousands, tens of thousands of young people, the next generations of geographers, which is something Peter would have really, really appreciated. Peter's role in the Society extended far beyond the simple curation of maps. He had a hand, for example, in the formation of the Society's specialist photographic archive, in the early introduction of computers in the library, in overseeing the book and journal purchasing policy, in the physical housing of the collections, and in the Society's first major map published for 30 years in 1987 of the mountains of Central Asia, which the Society and Mount Everest Foundation jointly worked on between 1982 and its publication. As both a geographer and a very able linguist, he was also actively involved with PCGN, the Permanent Committee on Geographical Names, that is located upstairs on the second floor of Lowther Lodge, and he was their chairman for a number of years. And he masterminded the Society's exhibition and catalogue to mark the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey in 1991. Peter retired from the RGS and his beloved map room in November 1991 and was succeeded by Andrew Tatum as keeper. His work for the Society and for cartography was recognised in that same year with the Society's Murchison Award for services to cartography, a very well-deserved award for a knowledgeable, quiet, and unassuming man with a twinkle in his eye, a ready, warm smile of encouragement and support for anyone who asked for it. A man who was able to pursue his passions for geography, maps, and map research, and the RGS throughout an illustrious career, and who, in so doing, enriched this institution and its objective to advance geographical science. I believe he felt he had returned home for the last years of his formal career. In a letter to his lifelong friend, Ian Mumford, in December 1943, when Peter was just 16 and at Latimer Upper School, Peter wrote of the RGS, I quote again, "I have tasted some delights at that fount of pure learning, and I long for more. Oh, that map room! It is nearly paradise." Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Paul Hancock, and I retired as Director of the Defence Geographic Centre in October 2015. But more relevant in terms of this talk is that I joined the Ministry of Defence as an Assistant Map Research Officer in August 1975. My personal memory of Peter, therefore, only covers the last 8 years of his MOD career, and I'm immensely grateful to the several retired colleagues who have so generously, often amusingly, and without exception, very warmly sent me their own memories and anecdotes about Peter, which I have shamelessly drawn upon in this talk. Any factual errors or misremembering could, in the finest civil service tradition, be the fault of any of us, but none of us will own up to it. Like many colleagues of my generation, our first encounter with Peter was at a civil service recruitment board for the map research officer class. Early in 1975, in Northumberland Avenue, the chairman of my interview board, a larger-than-life character who smoked a fat cigar throughout, saw from my application that I was from Yorkshire and a cricket fan, and confined his questions to the batting prowess of Geoffrey Boycott. Peter, in stark contrast, subjected me with a professorial air to gentle but forensic questioning about the use and merits of hill shading on Ordnance Survey maps. And never have first impressions been so durable and revealing. Entering the less than glamorous, I'm sure you'll agree, surroundings of Block A government buildings, Huckrise South, Tolworth in Surrey, was a totally immersive experience in all things relating to maps, as the home of the Map Research and Library Group. The building originated as part of the war effort, when land was taken over by the Ministry of Works and developed from green fields in the 1940s, with 3 blocks of low, single-storey brick buildings, which were meant to be a temporary structure, but remained in government hands for a variety of uses, including by the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. All the buildings comprised a very long central corridor, leading off which were spurs housing office and storage accommodation. Think of a hospital layout of wards leading symmetrically off a long corridor. An almost identical building, conveniently located just across the road, housed the Directorate of Overseas Surveys, which was established after the Second World War to map those parts of the British Empire and latterly countries throughout the Commonwealth which had no survey capability of their own. I think I probably ought to point out, most of you will be able to see him, but there is Peter. And you will probably recognise, some of you, some other members of the staff. Block A and what became MRLG was to be Peter's physical and spiritual home for the duration of his 33-year career as a Ministry of Defence civil servant. Peter developed his lifelong passion, and it was a passion, as Rita has said, it was a passion, for maps as a young schoolboy. After completing his national service with the Meteorological Office, Peter read geography at St John's College, Cambridge, and on the 18th of December 1950, joined the Directorate of Survey at Tolworth as a map curator. I think I should have another. So he's progressed from the 3rd row and through here onto the front row. And you'll see a further progression in a later photograph. This is just one half of an image, in fact, so it's the half of the image which has actually got sort of Peter here on it. The likes of Bunny Lewis that some of you remember, and others, Mick Boehner. Peter was to spend his career in what subsequently became the Map Research Officer, or MRO class in the Ministry of Defence, rising to its highest grade in 1964 as Chief Map Research Officer, at the relatively young age of 38, and becoming responsible for the Map Research and Library Group. That title in many ways says it all. MRLG provided the cartographic research support for the production of maps and charts by the drawing officers of the mapping and charting establishment of the Royal Engineers, abbreviated to MCERE, located in Feltham, some 12 miles away from Tolworth, to meet the needs of the British Army and the Royal Air Force. It also housed the Ministry of Defence Map Library, which was and remains the largest global collection of current mapping in the country, and at its peak contained over 2 million maps, making it one of the very largest in the world. Its staff also comprise one of the largest communities of graduate geographers in the country. The Map Research Officer class was established in 1958, largely due to the drive and determination of one H.A.G. Lewis, more widely known as Bunny Lewis. It was termed a departmental class in the civil service in that its members were only employed by one ministry, the War Office to begin with, which was amalgamated with the Admiralty and the Air Ministry in 1964 to become the Ministry of Defence. Entry to the class was largely restricted to university graduates with a degree in geography, mathematics, or a related discipline. It endured as a distinct profession for 30 years until 1988, when its members were incorporated into a new unified mapping and charting officer class. As Chief Map Research Officer, with most of the profession under his leadership, Peter was to play a pivotal role in the recruitment, training and development of the class, and its work in ensuring the MOD Map Library became a preeminent collection of contemporary world mapping alongside a wide-ranging, innovative and resourceful research capability. Peter's profound and prolific knowledge of mapping, coupled with his endless curiosity and interest in every aspect and detail of cartography, fostered a community which grew in skills and confidence to become increasingly influential in the professionalisation of the disciplines of cartographic librarianship and research, and the provision of authoritative geographic intelligence and advice. Colleagues recall his impromptu and memorable tutorials at gatherings to take a first look at newly arrived consignments of maps known as parcels, from which everyone learnt a great deal as Peter commented on their background and significance. In the library, Peter played a vital role in the development and promotion of standardised map classification and cataloguing systems and practices, both nationally and internationally. And as we shall hear more of later, together with Helen Wallace, helped to establish the British Committee for Map Information and Cataloguing Systems, known as BRICMICS. Peter was also a great advocate for improving the training and development opportunities for the profession and actively encouraged further education and lifelong learning. He developed greater professionalism in the management of the library by sending members of the class on specialist academic training courses in librarianship, information science and foreign languages. In addition, he initiated for the first time a planned course of induction training for new entrants and strengthened ties with the school, now the Royal School of Military Survey, which developed courses especially for civilians. The school was co-located with our military colleagues in 4-2 Survey Engineer Regiment in Hermitage near Newbury. Peter also actively encouraged fellowship of this society, as we've heard, and membership of the British Cartographic Society, in which the Map Research Officer class played a prominent role, as we shall also hear about later. I think I'm missing a slide. No, I'll go back to that one. The Bible of good map library practice had, until the 1970s, been the manual developed by Captain Parsons in the 1940s, known as the Blue Book, which underpinned the cataloguing of maps and the huge card indexing system which held the highly detailed records of the MOD Map Library. With remarkable foresight, Peter saw in the 1970s the potential of automating those records, but knew that change was needed to the Parsons Manual to accommodate the requirements of automation and reflect the changing political map of the world. He tasked Brian Candy, who was to succeed Peter on his retirement, with this challenging task, and Brian clearly recalls the very close interest Peter took in the project. Peter would engage extensively in weekly meetings on the finer points of map classification and the best sequence of fields for data capture. The foundations Peter had laid were to come to successful fruition many years later, as the library records eventually became fully automated in the groundbreaking project known as MobMap. Peter was also instrumental in ensuring that the deposit requirements placed on all government departments by the National Archives were followed by the MOD's own map collection. Given that there was no public access to the MOD map library, in so doing he made increasingly available to a wider audience the official operational map series of World War I, including the trench maps, and World War II mapping. He also established the map disposals programme so that the many thousands of maps which were no longer required in the MOD's own collection went in perpetuity to other recognised collections, including the copyright libraries, university collections, and the RGS's own collection, as we've heard. Despite Peter's strong interest in the history of cartography, the MOD Map Library was first and foremost a working collection of the best available contemporary mapping and did not serve primarily as an historic archive. Within Peter's domain, there was also the little-known duplicate map library, which was housed in a former RAF command and control bunker at Worthy Down near Weymouth, and contained some especially valuable and sensitive parts of the collection, including duplicate copies of original native mapping of the Soviet Union, which were captured from the Germans at the end of the Second World War. These proved an invaluable resource in producing NATO standard military mapping of Warsaw Pact countries at a time when the Cold War remained deeply frozen. Peter's great knowledge and expertise in the mapping of Eastern Europe, and Poland in particular, came to the fore in much of this work. Alongside the library, there were the several area research divisions which specialise in the forensic evaluation of the currency and accuracy of the source materials which were to be used in the production of military standard map series. This involved research into geodesy, the mathematical basis of map construction, including grid, spheroid, and datum systems, the evaluation of their positional accuracy, the interpretation and translation of map legends in a wide variety of native languages, and studies into international boundaries. See yourself there, Barbara. This work culminated in the production of highly detailed source material forms, or SMFs, which gave the cartographic drawing officers at Feltham guidance and instruction in the production of British official military mapping. This included the several global series produced in close collaboration with the United States, including joint operations graphics and tactical pilotage and operational navigation charts. In addition, there were the many series associated with British overseas possessions, including Hong Kong and Cyprus, and crucially supporting military operations, notably in Northern Ireland and the Falklands. This work drew on both a map library and a book and document collection of text-based sources, guidebooks, and the like, together with a huge collection of foreign language dictionaries, including one of my personal favourites, a Welsh to Russian dictionary. Peter had a particular interest in toponymy, as we've heard, the study of place names, and was for many years a leading figure and sometime chair of the Permanent Committee for Geographic Names for British Official Use, PCGN, an organisation headed for many years by the legendary Plack Geelan, and still housed here in Lowtherlog with its small team of highly talented and influential linguists. Whilst the main body of the Map Research Officer class was based at Tolworth, members also staffed Survey 3, one of the staff branches that formed the Directorate of Military Survey headquarters in Feltham. Survey 3 was also headed by a Chief Map Research Officer, initially Bunny Lewis, and latterly in Peter's time, Mick Bainan. Survey 3 and MRLG were mutually dependent, with Survey 3 providing the policy guidance governing MRLG activities, its library holdings and procurement priorities, and also negotiating exchange agreements with international partners and controlling security and release matters. Members of the class also served in several posts overseas, typically on 3-year tours, including in the United States, within Peter's time the Army Map Service, which later became the Defence Mapping Agency, and also in Germany, Hong Kong, Aden, Cyprus, Egypt, and East Africa. A colleague obliged to answer Peter's phone in his absence recalls that eminent explorers of the time, including John Blashford Snell, and Ranulph Fiennes were in regular contact with Peter, seeking advice on mapping to support the planning of their latest ventures. In addition, those writing their memoirs would approach Peter for his help, including one Spike Milligan. On non-meeting days, which were probably not that often, Peter would drive into his number one parking place at Block A, nearest the door, of course, in his Volkswagen Beetle, wearing his trademark tweed sports jacket. We always knew which were meeting days, as he would then be in a suit. The Tolworth community enjoyed a very varied and active social life outside office hours, which reinforced the impression of a seamless transition from life as a university student into the world of work. A vibrant MRLG Sports and Social Association ran football and cricket teams, darts, Tempton bowling and badminton tournaments, evening wine and cheese parties, Christmas reviews, and an ever-popular annual slideshow in which keen amateur photographers would talk to images of their travels and hobbies. A colleague with a particularly keen memory recalls a sequence of slides put together by Peter's lifelong friend, Ian Mumford, who was a naturist, of a nude beauty contest from the south of France, the most memorable aspects of which were one of Ian in his National Health Service glasses, lounging in a deck chair wearing nothing but a bunch of grapes. And he had contrived a shot of the full frontal naked female lineup juxtaposed with a picture of Peter peering through binoculars. As you might imagine, this created absolute hysteria. Peter paid a final visit to Feltham and the Defence Geographic Centre some 10 years ago and was full of praise and enthusiasm for all that he saw and to see his vision all those years ago of an automated map library come to fruition. He subsequently wrote to me as director a very touching letter of warm thanks in his instantly recognisable italicised hand. Peter retired from the MOD in 1983 at the age of 57. The heart of Peter's professional career is inextricably linked with both his leadership of the Map Research and Library Group and the development of the Map Research Officer class. His leadership skills were highly influential but low-key, and being somewhat shy by nature meant he was not always comfortable leading from the front. He also took a relaxed view of the word annual in dealing with annual staff reports. However, Peter was a man ahead of his time, encouraging his staff to look ahead to the new world of technology and encouraging initiatives such as flexible working hours and part-time working, which enable women with family commitments to continue with their careers. A radical development at a time when the MOD was very much a man's world. Colleagues have shared with me their warm memories of Peter as a quiet, kind and thoughtful man who came across as much a seasoned academic as a serving civil servant. As one colleague neatly summed it up, Tolworth under Peter was a constant education and a great place to work with an open and supportive culture. Peter was respected far and wide, both within defence and far beyond, for his professionalism and wide-ranging and profound knowledge of world cartography and as an exceptional geographer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Ian Spencer, and I'm the current director of the Defence Geographic Centre, having received the baton from Paul in 2015, and I just had to take it from him again. I joined the Map Research and Library Group as a fresh geography graduate in 1990, walking in through the very same door that we just saw. And I got into trouble earlier for pointing out that it was 5 years before I was born that Barbara did the same thing. The place hadn't changed at all. I regret I never met Peter myself, and I feel something of a fraud standing here today. But I'm very aware of Peter and his impact on the organisation, and have been from the very start of my career. Some of you I know will have worked in MRRG or in similar organisations, and it's very normal for newly minted and naive recruits to be immediately indoctrinated through mandatory exposure to lots of stories. Some of them probably weren't true or were very embellished, and also a plethora of cultural and physical evidence of those who went before. Some of the stories invoked a mixture of ambivalence or fear. Some of them invoked relief that people were at last no longer in the building. There were very few who I heard about who I sensed were spoken about with unbounded respect or with reverence, and Peter was one of those few. I should say there's no link between the slides and the words, by the way. There's just to make sure I don't run over time. I've always had a keen interest in the history of our organisation, but it's taken 32 years and sight of the obituaries and documents that were prepared for today for me to really properly appreciate how substantial Peter's impact was and is. Now more than ever, I regret not having had the opportunity to meet him. And it's a great honour for me to stand here today to give you a very brief insight into the lasting legacy of Peter's work as a geographer. We've heard about Peter's contribution to MROLG and his leadership of the former MRO profession. As Paul explained, the MRO profession was incorporated into the Mapping and Charting Officer profession in 1988. That profession was therefore just 2 years old when I joined in 1990 as a Mapping and Charting graduate trainee. I think that before the end of my first day, I was already very aware that the joining of the MROs and the Cartos, as they were called, and a few other disciplines had been very contentious. Even today, there are still people serving in the organisation who refer to others as an MRO or a Carto. It really hasn't changed very much. I was very happy to be part of a profession, and I still have my copy of the Mapping and Charting Professional Practice Booklet, which I'll keep forever. The name of the profession was ideal. It described exactly what we did. During that first year, I was indoctrinated into many of the skills that an MRO would have been expected to develop. And one of the benefits of being a graduate trainee at the time was a rapid exposure to lots of different areas of work. My first few months were in the Map Library's Middle East section, just as we were preparing for the first Gulf War. Paul mentioned Peter's ambition for automating the Map Library, and that had been realised through a new system that was cutting edge at the time called ModMap. Unfortunately, our section in the library had not yet adopted the new system. So even though it was in the 1990s at this point, I found myself creating map catalogue records by hand, filling out card indexes, and I became very comfortable with delving through all of those many, many drawers of small cards, and the ones that I wrote really weren't really legible. And I pity those who automated them after my time. It's because I was rushing, because we were at war. I also conducted map and records research to develop our understanding of the historical alignments of the boundaries of the Baltic states, when they were still, of course, part of the Soviet regime. The fact that we are today dealing with increasingly complex geopolitical challenges along the former boundaries of the USSR demonstrates how vital and timeless this kind of work is. Although I carried out this work many years after Peter had left the organisation, I know that the environment was largely unchanged, and you saw some of the photos in Paul's presentation. Largely unchanged from the area that Peter will have worked in himself and helped to create. So I can really appreciate how his passion for the work developed. As the 1990s progressed, the Directorate of Military Survey moved from the Army Department into what we now know as Defence Intelligence, or the Defence Intelligence Staff, as it was known at the time. The Mapping and Charting establishment gradually reduced in size from the 900-strong organisation I joined. The work became increasingly computer-based. Some traditional skills were, of course, lost along the way, but the professional guidance that built on Peter's work has always been retained for reference. In 2000, Military Survey joined with the Joint Air Reconnaissance Centre, or JARIC, to form the Defence Geographic and Imagery Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as DGIA. MCE was renamed at that same time to become known as the Defence Geographic Centre, and its first director was Maggie Jacobs, later followed by Stuart Haynes, and then Paul Hancock. DGIA's name has changed several times over the past 20 years, which is possibly why most of you will never hear of it. It's now known as the National Centre for Geospatial Intelligence, or NCGI. But I'm happy to report that DGC's identity and its distinctiveness has survived, due in a large part to the strength of our reputation as a trusted name internationally. Along the way, the mapping and charting profession was renamed the Geospatial Analyst profession. That was an attempt to improve alignment with our colleagues elsewhere in defence intelligence. After being promoted to grade 7 and working in several broadening roles, I found myself sort of back where I started in 2007. But this time I was in charge of the map research functions and the map library. It was a very daunting prospect given what I knew then about my predecessors. If I knew what I know now about my predecessors, including Peter especially, I probably would have run in the opposite direction because I could never hope to sort of fulfill the role and fill those shoes. DGC has continuously built on the professional standards foundations provided by the MRO and the mapping and charting professions, and we define ourselves using a comprehensive functional competence framework which sets the skills and training required across a range of specialist functions. In the late noughties, there was a realization that the other specialist areas in defense intelligence, such as imagery analysis and all source analysis, would be able to deliver better outputs if they properly used geospatial information and geospatial analysis techniques, rather than simply using a geographer to create a map to display their results. We also realized that in focusing mainly on physical geography and topography in particular, we were ignoring the importance of human geography. In order to properly understand what's going on, why, and what might happen next in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had to develop a way to describe and analyze the types of information that would not normally be seen on the topographic map. After many years of hard work with our international partners, the traditional mapping organizations and beyond, we have broadened and matured geography in defense and intelligence to a level that I believe Peter would have strongly approved of. Over several years and many joint projects, we persuaded a sometimes unwilling UK and international community to recognize that geospatial understanding and geospatially referenced analysis is a transformative game changer. In the UK, we exported the Defence Geographic Centre's geography experts into those other teams, and we put geography centre stage. We expanded our functional competence framework to include a broader set of skills and applications. You'll have seen some of the benefits of that work evident in the MOD and Defence Intelligence public reporting on the developments in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, even today. For many years as a profession, we felt isolated. The old mapping and charting profession included at one time Ordnance Survey and the UK Hydrographic Office. But as those organisations became agencies during the 1990s and changed their employee terms and conditions away from the standard civil service model, we mappers and charters at Feltham and Tolworth, still at the time, found ourselves in a reduced profession, working primarily in DGC and a few small parts of defence intelligence. DGC is now reduced to just over 330 people, and not all of them are geographers. It would have been too easy to become inward-looking, but we instead sought to promote geography more widely to ensure both our survival as a profession and to ensure that the continued relevance of our work. We sought to increase our engagement with the Royal Geographical Society to promote chart geographer accreditation within the workforce and speak up for geography everywhere we went. We're still very actively supporting the Permanent Committee on Geographical Names, and through that and the fact that there's now a very active movement of people across the civil service, we start to discover and understand that there were many more people out there doing geographical and geospatial work. Of course there would be, why wouldn't there be? The problem is that many of them, nearly all of them, were not part of an established profession. They were often invisible and poorly understood and undervalued by their employing organisations. A few of those people self-organised into a support group, which started to make the case for a broader government geography profession, supported by the RGS. And in 2018, the brand new government geography profession was created, led by David Wood, who's a senior civil servant in DEFRA. Initially, it was subordinated to the government science and engineering profession, but it grew so quickly that a case was successfully made for the profession to stand alone in its own right, sponsored by a new geospatial commission in the Cabinet Office. Today, the government geography profession has over 1,300 members. You might be asking what on earth that all of this has to do with Peter Clark. Well, the professions are defined by the skills and quality of their people, measured by their results and impact, and driven and assured by the standards that define what they do and how they should do it. From map research officer through mapping and charting officer and geospatial analyst to what we now call the defence geography profession, you can trace the lasting legacy of what I understand to have been Peter's desire to be the very best of geographers and to professionalise the application of geographical knowledge and skills. Setting aside our colleagues in Ordnance Survey and the UK Hydrographic Office, We were and remain one of the largest civil service employers of geographers. And we were the only area to have the pre-existing and well-established functional competence framework built around geographical and geospatial skills. The Defence Geography Profession Functional Competence Framework provided the foundation upon which the government geography profession has been able to build, providing ready-made skills definitions and contributing to the definition of a wide range of job role specifications. The government geography profession is now a key part of the government analysis function. It succeeded in changing the government's rulebook for analysis in support of government policy making and implementation to include a new requirement for contributions from geography specialists. The government geography profession continues to grow, and we're seeing and promoting the work of all its members through our annual Geography and Government Awards. We've also established a very strong, mutually supportive relationship with the Society here. We have representatives on the Society's professional and chartered geographer assessor committees. We have influenced and supported the case for establishing a new early career professional recognition for young geographers as an incentive for them to remain and grow within the profession. And the overall winner amongst winners of the Geography and Government Awards receives their prize at the annual Society Awards ceremony. I hope it's now clear why I can stand here today and confidently assure you that Peter Clark's contribution as a geographer continues to be felt and be a driving force in our community. I am very proud to be the head of the Defence Geography profession and one of the deputy heads of the government geography profession, with responsibility, in my case, for professional standards. It's very humbling and a great privilege to be in a role in which I am temporarily the guardian of Peter Clark's outstanding geographical legacy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, now you've had your cup of tea and your cake, Barbara's assured me that if I stand up here, you will all shut up. So, welcome back. And that was an absolutely fascinating half hour for me, meeting so many old friends. And if there's one legacy from Peter Clark, it's got to be that we come together in such a meeting of friendship as we've got today. So, one of the difficulties, again, in the second half of this sort of thing, is that everything I wrote down, of course, has already all been said to one degree or other. So I will sort of go through my notes, but I'm going to ad-lib it a bit. And I know some people, and I'm looking at Barbara now, will be horrified at that, but you'll have to excuse me. I stand here as president of the British Cartographic Society, and it's the second time I've done this job. And I mention that because it has a very important resonance back to Peter's life, which I'll come to in a moment. Peter never took on a role within the British Cartographic Society of president or vice president, even though he would have been eminently qualified to do it. But nonetheless, he was an incredibly influential person in its original formation and how it developed over the decades. He was a founding member. And I did go back into I'm sad enough, I did go back into the records. He joined on the 9th of October 1963, literally a month after the charity was established. Next year in 2023 is the 60th anniversary of the BCS. And I'd like to think that he would have been exceedingly proud of the role that the BCS has played within the cartographic community and what it's achieved over that time and continues to play in developing the cartographic profession going forward. And I will dwell a bit more on that because my time when I worked with Peter was a short 4.5 years, but it was very formative. So while Peter was head of MRLG at Tolworth, which you've heard all about, he encouraged staff to join the BCS. And not only did he encourage them to join, but he supported them when they wanted to get more involved, they wanted to take a bigger role, and he let them go to conferences and attend meetings and present. He himself was a regular of many of these events, and there's a lot of you here today, so I'm not going to sort of dwell on. Many of you, I hope, have been to BCS symposia in the past, and you will all have your own personal memories of the sorts of things that went on there. fantastic educational talks, a lot of training and development, but also a lot of fun and a lot of friendships made, and Peter was a core part of that. It's always been known as a friendly society, the BCS, and it's been very inclusive in terms of the whole cartographic community. And Peter did play a very important role in all of that. Let me just move it on. No, that's the wrong way, clearly. Start again. How about that? There you go. Phew, my technology's not failed me. I didn't need the technician. Phew. So I've only got one slide, and some people have been kind enough today to say, you haven't changed a bit. Here's a proof to that lie that I clearly have. The years have affected me as much as it affects everybody. The BCS has two ways of recognising people in the cartographic community for their contribution to that process. One is to give people honorary fellowship, and there are a number of those. We have about 12 of them at the moment, and that continually gets added to. But we have, more importantly, the BCS Award, which is given to people who make a significant and long-lasting contribution to the overall subject of cartography and map making. And Peter is one of the recipients of those, and we've only in those 60 years issued 8 of those medals. There are at least one other sitting in this audience, and I won't say who they are, but we, as you can see here, I was privileged as the first time I was president to give Peter the award. And I think it was absolutely something that recognised his role in the society and was very important. For me, it was particularly important because my career spanned not just working at Tolworth, which I did for 10 years, but also I spent 4 years in academia. I worked for a couple of large corporates, one in the UK, one in the US, and I've been an entrepreneur. But it all stemmed from one thing. That was being able to do a PhD while I was still working at Tolworth. I've been there about 4 years. Peter was just about getting ready to go, but he hadn't quite gone. And I knew that I wanted to pursue a master's, perhaps part-time. I went to Birkbeck College in London, saw Professor David Rind and said to him, what can I do? And he said, we've got this great new technology, GIS. Probably never heard of it. Come and do a PhD in it. And I thought, oh, that sounds pretty good. But there was a rub. Someone had to pay for the tuition fees. So next day I knocked on Peter's door. Peter, I've got this great idea. This is what I would like to do. And without blinking, he said, I'm sure we can sort that out. You do it in your own time. You pay for all your travel expenses. We'll pay for your tuition. That seemed to be a really good deal. And that sort of summed up his support that he gave to so many people as a consequence of them wanting to learn, to develop, whether they stayed within the cartographic community or they moved on. We had to come up, though, with a topic that Peter thought would be acceptable to MOD. Difficult. In the end, we decided that what we were going to do is try and use this brand new technology that no one had ever heard of to produce goings maps. Goings maps are essentially maps where you are trying to model whether or not a tank can run through a piece of countryside. Those activities, those projects, perhaps have some fairly serious resonances with what's going on today and continue to have. But once we decided on the project, Peter just let me go and run. But he did keep a very close eye on what I was doing, just to make sure that everything was in the context of what he thought would be suitable for Ministry of Defence. So he was always asking me, how's it going? What's the research doing? And when he got to the writing up phase, although he'd moved on, he was still, what's going on? Wants to know what's happening. But I did find out that actually he already knew exactly what was going on. He knew he had a back door to the whole thing. Merle Abbott, who many of you will know is his partner at the time, she was also the librarian at Birkbeck College. So she would make notes of everything I was doing and pass that on to Peter. There was one memorable occasion when he asked me what I had been doing the previous evening, and I sort of mumbled a bit and didn't say too much, and he said, "But you were doing some mapping." Well, what happened in those days, of course, we had a huge VAX computer. You'd plug something into this fledgling ArcInfo software, and it would take overnight to run. So being good students, what do you do when you've done that? You go to the pub. And he knew that we had been to the pub, and he was just curious to know how we'd managed to do all that work and go to the pub. He knew what it was like. So all of those things are really important in my memory, but it also sums up for me the way Peter treated all the people who worked for him in terms of encouraging them to do other things. And Dave Watt has just reminded me that so many people, when you go to gatherings across the whole geo community these days, you end up with meeting people who were spent, even if it was 6 months or a year, at Tolworth or their successors, and who value that as part of their education and their professional development. And I have to say, Peter was one of the first people that congratulated me when I got my PhD. Fortunately, he'd moved on, because a little while later I left MOD. One group that Peter was very involved with within the BCS was the Map Curators group. And I'd just like to, I put a quote up here, and actually I think Anne from Cambridge University Library's here. Yes, Anne's over there. It's actually Anne said this. She may not remember saying it, but apparently she did say it. And I think this sort of sums up Peter and his role. And the current chair of the Map Curators group within BCS, Paula Williams, said, you know, this is a great way to be remembered. What a lovely way for him to be remembered. So I know I haven't got a lot of time, but I do want to just say one other thing. There is a legacy to all of this, and a legacy to all those who developed their careers and have been, if you like, through those sort of caring hands of development of Peter and the MRLG group. There's a huge amount of change going on in the cartographic community. Ian mentioned the geography profession. The British Cartographic Society has just signed an MOU of understanding to provide mapping support to GGP. It goes round in circles, and a lot of this is about the legacy that Peter's left behind. And I think that's my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Jerry Zielo, the current chair of the Charles Close Society, which was co-founded and chaired for many years by Peter Clark. I'm honoured to be the third of his successors. Peter set the bar very high indeed, as indeed did his two learned successors, Dr. Yolande Hodson, here with me today, and Dr. Chris Board. I remember being given the warmest of welcomes and a great introduction to the Charles Close Society by Peter, who was the most encouraging of society chairmen and inspirational in the amount of advice and friendship given to this new member 35 years ago. But I first knew Peter when he was right here in these hallowed portals, in this very room, as curator of maps and keeper of the RGS. Even then, he showed his innate skills in helping me to understand the whereabouts of the origins of some of my forebears from a small and Polish-speaking village in uttermost Austrian Empire, an area, incidentally, now in the Ukraine. Weren't they lucky to come to Britain when they did? Peter was, of course, a fluent Polish speaker, and he took the initiative and the time to kindly arrange for me to have a translation of the Polish State Gazetteer entry on the Ziela's home village. In those days of the post-First World War, a region that was in the Poland's Carpathians. I didn't even have to ask him, Peter just did it. The full title of our society, as founded by Peter and the smallish number of far-sighted founders, is the Charles Close Society for the Study of Ordnance Survey Maps. Peter, of course, as you'll hear in a moment from Yo and others here today, has had many other interests. So this new venture, 41 years ago now, sat happily with and cross-pollinated with other interests of Peter's. I hope this is a tradition that we have continued at CCS, recently encouraging all comers to join in with our lockdown meetings for the first time online, a policy which I feel sure has helped our society, K.Clark Society, to now achieve over 700 members. Recently, some of our meetings have begun to be held with other societies jointly, notably the British Cartographic Society, which himself as a past president would have pleased Peter. Despite his advanced years and health issues, Peter was able to attend some of these online meetings thanks to the help and encouragement from his daughter Anne. I'm told too that he'd liked what the Society was doing at the time, and shortly before his death, Peter was kind enough to remember the Charles Close Society, which has been the grateful recipient of his generous endowment. This will be used to create a fund for CCS members and others to conduct original research into the history of the several ordnance surveys. We hope it will also in time allow further research and publication of existing work into aspects of ordnance and military surveys, which was dear to Peter's heart and interest. So on behalf of this present chair and the committee and the whole membership of CCS, I pay tribute to our founder and friend, Peter K.Clark. And now my CCS colleague and the Society's other co-founder, Dr. Jo Hodson, with her own tribute to Peter.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to say that Barbara was very generous in thanking everybody this morning for doing things. But on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank you, Barbara, for all the work you have put in to make this afternoon possible, and also to Sarah Tyack for providing the really splendid cake that we had. Well done to both of you. Thank you very much. Now, Peter was the founding chairman of the Charles Close Society for the Study of Ordnance Survey Maps. He was 54 when the society was founded, and by that time he had been deeply interested in and had studied ordnance survey maps for at least 46 years. These, together with geological maps, were what he referred to when a teenager as his two favorite topics. It all began when his mother, Elsie, who was a teacher, took him on a bus trip when he was 8 years old. She had brought with her an ordnance survey map so that he could see how the view from the bus compared with its representation on the map. That was one very enlightened mother. This was the beginning of a lifetime passion for maps and geography for Peter. 4 years later, now aged just 12 and a pupil at Latimer Upper School, Peter came top of his class in his first year and chose as his prize Kenneth Earle's book, The Geological Map. This was an unusual and perhaps precocious choice for one so young. By the age of 16, Peter was writing to his school friend Ian Mumford, demonstrating an extraordinarily sophisticated appreciation of cartography, topography, and geology, and showing that even at that age he was acquiring advanced books on the subjects and building up a large map collection, all paid for with money earned while fire watching during wartime school days. And for example, age 17, he writes to Ian in December 1943 about your Ilkley tourist map. He says, closer examination proves it to be even more interesting than you think. What you took to be 2 colour hashes is in fact 1 colour hashes and a bleak hillshade in purple. In other words, this map is one of the great special Killarney type. So you see, Paul, when you were asked about Ordnance Survey hill shading in your interview, there was a lot behind that question. Anyway, Peter is most insightful and, again, well ahead of the times in noting how, although many people had given a great deal of time to the study of pre-Ordnance Survey maps, yet, he says, far too little serious attention has been devoted to the study of old Ordnance Survey maps. He wonders why this was. Perhaps, he ventures, because they were official and because people believed them to be stereotyped and therefore easily classified. He liked to think that he was on the borders of a relatively little explored field. Well, he was indeed, and it was to be over 40 years before others, guided by him, took on the task. From what he says in his correspondence, he clearly devoted much time to researching and looking at Ordnance Survey maps in a way which certainly to me appears to have been completely new, certainly in the 1940s. The RGS was, as you have heard from Rita, central to Peter's map life from a very early age. He introduced me to the Society and its Ordnance Survey collections, and I joined some 50 years ago now. Only I wish I had had lifetime membership like him. The RGS has made up in my subscriptions what it lost in Peter's, I think. Oh dear. But anyway, that aside, from the Ordnance Survey point of view, the Royal Geographical Society had an unrivaled collection of Ordnance Survey experimental mapping, a real treasure trove to be found nowhere else, and acquired during those golden years of the first half of the 20th century, when the relationship between Ordnance Survey and the RGS was especially strong. All Peter's knowledge about collecting Ordnance Survey maps was transmitted to me in my early 20s and during the following decades. Just 25 years after his accounts of his own map and book buying exploits with Ian, the pair of them were to take me with them on occasional Saturday morning forays into local bookshops, and I was introduced to the wonders of one of Peter's favourite maps, Mudge's Map of Kent, and the old series Ordnance Survey 1-inch maps. These bookshops were Aladdin's caves, and Peter started me on a lifetime habit of map buying, except I'm now running out of space. By the later 1970s, when the idea for establishing a society for those interested in Ordnance Survey maps was suggested, Peter was the obvious person from whom to ask advice. After all, he had laid the foundations for the society by inculcating in others his great knowledge and enthusiasm for Ordnance Survey maps. Anyway, he took up the suggestion with enormous and infectious enthusiasm and encouragement. In 1980, when the CCS was finally founded, Peter was instrumental in persuading Helen Wallace, then deputy keeper of the map library of the British Library, which was still then housed in the old British Museum building, to allow the newly founded society to use the British Library Map Library as its official address, which it still does to this day. The new society held regular meetings at which Peter was always present, imparting his enthusiasm and knowledge to young and old alike. And here at one of them, I think this was at Ordnance Survey, 1989, Peter is presenting the 6-year-old Gareth Batchelor with an Ordnance Survey gift. And in the background is his father, Bill. And I would just like to say, Bill was supposed to be here today, but very sadly, he died 2 weeks ago today. But this is also in memory of Bill, who had such a deep admiration for Peter. And of course, our committee meetings were often hilarious. Chris Ward's going to find this next slide hilarious. Weren't we all young, Chris? Where are you? And there was Peter, always providing us with information all the time. Well, in his capacity as keeper of the Royal Geographical Society, Peter was able to arrange for the Society's celebration of its 10th anniversary to be held at Lowther Lodge. And here he is cracking one of his perennial jokes. I mean, he was always joking. We were always in fits of laughter. And you see a young Jerry Zierler in the background. And also he was able to arrange for the CCS exhibition on the Ordnance Survey 1-inch map to be held at Lowther Lodge for the bicentenary in 1991. Together with his partner Merle Abbott, who was map curator in the geography department of Birkbeck, he sought and received permission for the Society's annual general meetings and map markets to be held at Birkbeck, occasions which many of the long-standing members of the Society will remember well. Well, Peter finally retired as chairman in 1992. Throughout his life, Peter was a discerning collector of Ordnance Survey maps, with a special interest, as I said, in Mudge's map of Kent and in the old series 1-inch maps and geological mapping. And here he is on his 95th birthday with 2 splendid 1-inch geological survey maps framed behind him. He was so generous in sharing his knowledge. Brian Harley benefited greatly from Peter's expertise when compiling the notes for the David and Charles series of the 1-inch reproductions. Peter had to teach Brian how to look at a map properly and observe the detail. I'm sure they're both up there now, comparing notes. Now, Peter hardly published anything in writing about Ordnance Survey maps, but it was always evident when talking to him that he knew so much more, especially in the early days of the Society, than any of us who were labouring under his guidance. Later on, he was full of the admiration for the works of Roger Hellier and Richard Oliver and other CCS members. He retained his interest right to the end. Just a month before his death, he was discussing with me aspects of the survey of Lincolnshire in the first half of the 19th century. And finally, at the beginning of the 20th century, John Bartholomew, when describing the extent to which commercial mapping derived from the Ordnance Survey 1-inch series, referred to the Ordnance Survey as the mother of all maps. In a similar context, and taking account of the wide extent to which all of us who have written about Ordnance Survey mapping have benefited from Peter's ideas and enthusiastic and selfless guidance, I think we can regard him as the father of modern studies in Ordnance Survey history. Thank you.
Note this before I begin. We'll come into the story later. Greetings from the north. 27 years ago, I was here at RGS for a celebration of the life of Helen Wallace, an occasion I think remembered by some present today.
On the list of those attending, and I retain a copy, is the name Peter Clark. Peter, with his all-seeing eye, undoubtedly spotted and knew people present who'd occupied positions in or been associated with RGS for many years, as he had himself. I cannot forget that in the front row, sitting right under my nose, was a distinguished archaeologist, Sir Lawrence Curwen, director and secretary of RGS from 1945 to 1975. Next to him sat Lord Hunt of Llandfawrtydyn, remembered best, of course, as John Hunt of Everest fame. I can remember gazing down in awe. It was to RGS, too, that Peter gave the time and energy as keeper of maps in his latter position there after his retirement, as has been alluded to, and his unobtrusive communications network, and unobtrusive is the word, was still hard at work, not least to those of us in the Scottish mapping community. And it's Peter's legacy here in this context I want to highlight. For it may not be known to many of you, it may indeed vanish from human memory. Reference to Peter can be found in official documents, in the minutes of meetings, and with those societies to whom Peter gave much time. But there's no oral record captured of Peter in the Scottish context. I regret it proved impossible, much as we wanted it, to record Peter speaking with John C. Bartholomew, something we wanted but would have captured the essence of cartographic, what I call camaraderie, between the two of them and the deep knowledge they both possessed. Peter visited Edinburgh in 1973, soon after I took up my post in charge of maps in NLS. He'd heard of my appointment from Moira Courtman, here today, and then of the University of London Senate House Geography and Geology Library, and today a valuable map cataloguer for RGS as a volunteer. Moira had been on holiday up here and must have reported back to Peter. So when he arrived in the National Library, ostensibly to look at the maps and papers of General Sir George Murray, Quartermaster General during the Peninsular War, and later President of RGS between 1833 and 1835, Peter interrupted his researches, made his way to our then map room, introduced himself, and I can remember exactly where I sat at that time, and he invited me to go to Tolworth and to see MRLG for myself. So I did. And indeed, it looked like the image we saw. I was taken to Peter's room, and as we sat talking, he explained he wanted to make MRLG more open to other UK map collections and their staff, instead of destroying huge piles, multiple copies of superseded foreign mapping, to pass these on freely to the copyright libraries and elsewhere. I think the Bodleian Library came second in the batting order, and indeed we have Betty Fathers, who was second in that batting order, with us today. But we were suddenly interrupted by a knock at the door, and in flew this red-haired whirlwind, who Peter introduced to me as Barbara Bond. I learned later there'd been an emergency in Guatemala, which needed his attention. So Peter took me to his colleague, Derek Peart, who told me of his work in the Asian context. And later, Peter took me for lunch, having finished with Guatemala, with Peter Fletcher and Tony Arnold. And afterwards, I was shown around the map storage by Andy Callow. These introductions were very important to the National Library of Scotland, the start of very welcome interconnectivity between NLS and RLG, which continues to this day with the DGC. And I want to particularly mention Dave Watt, also here today, for he took over the mantle of Peter in continuing this link to NLS, but also to the Royal Geographical Society and myself. In 1975, with the Edinburgh University Library map curator, David Ferro, former convener of BCS Map Curators Group, immediately before Barbara Bond, and a few years before the long reign of Anne Sutherland, David and I put on a map training course for librarians and map curators. Peter, always keen to support us, dispatched 2 of his young MRLG colleagues to take part, one of whom is here today, Bruce Davis. The other was Pete Atherall. And the following year, at the annual symposium of BCS, held in the University of Aberdeen under Mike Wood's expert organisation, Peter introduced me to his other MRLG colleagues there, Di Bruce, now Thornton, and others, explaining rather than having 2 senior representatives from MRLG, he brought as many colleagues as he could by only claiming basic travel expenses. In this way, typical Peter, he explained junior colleagues got the chance to attend to, and to their great benefit. I was very struck by this idea and tried it out in the National Library of Scotland maps, to some difficulties with those above me. A few years later, on the 19th of November 1981, with Barbara Morris, then map curator in Edinburgh University Geography Department, and David Ferro, I organised the first of 14 Edinburgh 3-day cartographic events. And Peter, in close association with Yo Hodson, was asked to give the opening talk. I quote, "The Soldier as Surveyor, a history of British military mapmaking, 1540 to 1940. I still have my handwritten text of introduction as host, and I quote from it. I can best describe Peter as an inspired and inspiring map addict, one of the few addictions that is pleasurable, harmless, and can safely be transmitted to others. I continued in the 3 more senior staff in our map room by a process of what I might term osmosis to the other map room staff. Peter has been perhaps our greatest source of map lore and knowledge, and the ultimate authority to whom we have turned on many occasions for advice and help. By April 1982, due to burgeoning affairs in the South Atlantic, MRLG's Scottish connection was put to the test. A sudden phone call to the National Library of Scotland's Map Library at Peter Clark's urgent request, and from his colleague Peter Fletcher, had my NLS map colleague Pete Milne racing to our map stacks to uplift our holding of Argentinian-produced 1 to 250,000 mapping of its coastline. Pete held a mammoth phone call with Peter Fletcher, Pete reading out the exact survey and printing dates of NLS's sheets covering the required area of coast. The most recent were officially requisitioned by MOD, being the most up-to-date sheets it could locate in the UK. And Mary Gordon from MRLG arrived to uplift them, another Scottish link. They were returned later, but evidence of MOD's use of them showed in splatters of ink on their berceau. Peter's opening up of MRLG so potently in the early 1970s saw NLS Map Library in receipt of innumerable, seemingly never-ending large brown boxes stuffed with surplus mapping. Major efforts too sparked off by my staff member Philip Woodhall, who was converting the National Library's foreign map holdings to the E.J. Parsons classification scheme, and Philip using MOD's manual of map classification and cataloguing. It became our cartographic Bible, like others, and is so in the Royal Scottish Geographical Society today. I just want to mention a few names and activities of Peter's former staff working in Scotland, without doubt benefiting from their MRLG training. I think of Mick Ashworth, a former president of BCS, who took up a role as senior publishing manager with HarperCollins Publishers, in charge of all editorial and publishing aspects of Times and Collins, World Atlases and Maps, and now Director of Ashworth Maps and Interpretation, though still consultant editor to the Times Atlas of the World. At the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, in our 12-strong collections team of volunteers, we have the services of Blair White and of Jean Smith, both of whom trained at MRLG and both of whom were interviewed by Peter for the jobs, and a hard interview, I'm told it was. Blair has already added to and revised RSGS's record of our holding of maps of overseas countries using the map classification scheme and produced an electronic drawer inventory of our maps. For his outstanding work, Blair was awarded the Honorary Fellowship of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society in 2019. So a nice link to MRLG here. Jean Smith, too, has made an excellent start, but COVID unfortunately put a close to that for the time being, though we have now returned. Both Blair and Jean would have been here today, but unfortunately both are on holiday elsewhere. RSGS also has the occasional service of Andrew Cook, himself owing very much both to Peter Clark and indeed to Ian Mumford. I'd hoped to conclude, as suggested by Blair White, with Blair, Jean Smith, myself and Andrew raising a glass in a suitable Scots style to Peter's memory. This glass to contain a dram of a rare malt whisky made for Sir Ernest Shackleton. We deemed this appropriate both for RGS and RSGS. For as you know, Ernest Shackleton was secretary of RSGS for a short time, and one of our medals is named after him. But Blair and Jean not being here today, instead I'm raising in my hand a miniature whisky bottle, specially produced to mark the topping out ceremony of the second phase of the National Library of Scotland's Causeway Side building, in which its map library is. Almost 29 years ago today. It draws attention to Peter, finally, for in the National Library's annual report for 1988 to 1989, there's reference to our 8th three-day cartographic event and the inauguration of the new NLS map library. I quote, "The high point of the ceremony was the unveiling by Mr. K.Clark, Chairman of the Charles Close Society and keeper of the map room of the Royal Geographical Society, of a large mural depicting a third of Scotland at a scale of 1 to 50,000. This mural was gifted by the Ordnance Survey Scottish region, and the occasion was attended by some 90 guests representing map collections throughout the UK and Ireland. I want to end in the words of Scotland's national bard, words that are known the world over. For Auld Lang Syne, Peter, you did the Scottish community proud. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Barbara, for inviting BrickMix along to pay our tribute to Peter. I'm standing here because I'm the current chair of BrickMix, so let me just explain what BrickMix is. It began life as the British Committee for Map Catalogue Systems to act as a consultative committee for the discussion of matters of mutual interest between its members and those of the Ordnance Survey of Great Britain. It was set up in 1977 and renamed as an expanded BrickMix, the British and Irish Committee for Map Information and Catalogue Systems, in 1983. Having begun life as a British Library initiative, membership evolved to include representation from all the UK legal deposit libraries, so that's the British Library, National Libraries of Scotland and Wales, the Bodleian and Cambridge University Libraries, and the Library of Trinity College, Dublin. In addition, the Public Record Office, now the National Archives, the Royal Geographical Society, of course, and government involvement came from the outset, taking in the mapping and charting establishment of the Ministry of Defence. They were all present. So BrickMix became recognised as a cooperative body active throughout the map library network across the British Isles. And BRICMIC's membership umbrella extended to include the Hydrographic Office, British Geological Survey, professional bodies such as the Chartered Institute of Librarians and Information Professionals, formerly the Library Association, the Archives and Records Association, formerly the Society of Archivists, and of course the Map Curators Group of the British Cartographic Society. National Records Scotland and the Public Record of Northern Ireland, as well as the National Maritime Museum, also joined, whilst the University of London's remit at the table was expanded to include all university map collections. And in recent years, both the Royal Scottish Geographical Society and a representative from the commercial sector have joined the BRICMICS family. BRICMICS also became an Ordnance Survey Consultative Committee, and many people in the audience will remember those. Discussions commenced in 1983, an exploratory meeting taking place in 1984, and BRICMICS was first invited to the Ordnance Survey Director General's Conference in its own right in 1986. Peter first represented BRICMICS at the OSDG's conference in June 1987 and attended every subsequent conference until his retirement. BRICMICS continues to meet twice per annum, although the last couple of years have been more of a challenge, and we've adapted reasonably well to the world of Zoom gatherings. We last met, in fact, a week ago today. So, what about Peter's involvement on BRICMICS? He became a member by dint of his role as Chief Map Research Officer at the Map Research and Library Group. And having trawled through past BRICMICS minutes, we find that by 1983 he was representing both, and I quote, Ministry of Defence Map Library, unquote, and Map Curators Group BCS, so he was spreading his talents around. As we've already heard, he moved on from the MOD to this very building when he became Keeper of Collections, and by 1984 he'd seamlessly assumed the mantle of the RGS's representative on BRICMICS. So I've asked BRICMICS members who served alongside Peter all those years ago for recollections of his contribution to the map curating community, and understandably this has proved challenging as many of those who served alongside him are no longer with us. Peter's contributions to BRICMICS were predictably significant, wide-ranging and deeply influential. This can be demonstrated when inspecting past minutes, and a number of key contributions can be highlighted. So I'm just going to take a few extracts from the minutes because they just show the range and the perception of Peter's involvement. So going back to 1983 on the issue of preserving the nation's cartographic legacy, Peter Clark then commented on the persistence of the Ordnance Survey in calling itself the National Cartographic Archive at a time when it regarded the preservation of such an archive, i.e. the historical archive, as outside its remit, thus causing a certain amount of confusion as to its role. So I'm very perceptive there. And he goes on. 5 years later, he said, Peter Clark suggested that to describe out-of-date information as being of little use, and this was from the Ordnance Survey mission statement, was ill-phrased. On cartographic expertise within the map curating community, this is from 1984, Peter Clark pointed out that map libraries had not been consulted over the Ordnance Survey large-scale user survey which had been circulated to other bodies in 1983, and suggested BRICMICS ensure that appropriate members were included in the proposed OS small-scale user survey. Naturally, this happened. His willingness to be present at the forefront of cartographic development, 1985 now, Peter Clark had agreed to serve on the proposed working group on the archiving of remote sensing and digital databases. 1987, Peter Clark pointed out that OS would, through the topographic database, be able to maintain a complete record of change without having any clear responsibility for preserving it. The then Public Record Office felt that the OS had such a duty as the data were public records. On CartoNet, which some of you will remember, which was a map cataloguing aid, in 1986 Peter was at the forefront again. He volunteered for accuracy testing of corner plots on map catalogue records. and on cooperation between map collections from 1990, Peter Clark suggested that East European mapping might be an appropriate subject for an early union listing, especially considering the importance of these areas in environmental terms. He added that RGS might be interested in publishing a leaflet to explain what mapping is available. Never shy to innovate, in 1988, Peter was instrumental in setting up the National Association of Air Photo Libraries. He also kept a keen eye on digital developments, and in 1989-1990, responding to Ordnance Survey, he focused on their approach to marginal information on their newly created seamless data sets. His recommendation that they needed to state the last date of change plus dates of administrative boundaries was agreed in principle, though Ordnance Survey was unsure about the feasibility of such an approach. So, the 15th of May 1992 marked his final BrickMix attendance. Ironically, my first BrickMix was the next gathering the following November. There was a meal afterwards to which Peter and other recently retired BrickMix people were invited and honoured, so we were never present together at a single meeting. But I'd just like to add a little bit about his wider influence on the map curating community. And Margaret mentioned quite a lot about his opening up of the map collection of Tolworth and the sharing of MOD maps through its disposals programme. I'm pleased to announce to report, those large brown boxes that Margaret mentioned are still arriving on a regular basis, and for which all we libraries are extremely delighted. So thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody involved at the MOD. In terms of Peter the man, there's a lovely quote from Geraldine Beach, who a number of you will remember. Geraldine was formerly at the Public Record Office, and she says, we immediately hit it off, and Peter made it his business to induct me into the cartographic community in Great Britain and share his wide and deep knowledge with me. While Sarah Tyack, who's in the audience, Sarah's added, I recollect when BrickMix was set up, and I had the dubious honour of being secretary all those years ago. Peter was such an enabling colleague, always happy to give advice and collaborate for the benefit of maps and mappers of any and all descriptions. I'd just like to round off with a personal tribute, if I may. When I joined BrickMix in 1992, despite never being involved in the committee together, I did know Peter, and I'll be forever grateful to him for helping me out in the early days of my career. As a would-be map librarian in my early 20s, I was struggling to find a suitable post that would enable me to start out in my chosen profession. And job opportunities were few, but rather more plentiful than they are today. So I wrote to a number of eminent map curators, Peter being one, asking for advice. At the time, I was working for Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council on a Manpower Services Commission scheme, researching historic buildings for the borough's museum service. And one day, after being out on field work, I returned to the office, and colleagues excitedly reported that they'd taken a phone call from a Mr. Clark at the Royal Geographical Society, and could I ring him back? I duly did, and Peter was charm personified, interested, insightful. He took it upon himself to invite me to the RGS map room. I came in here, this very room, he introduced me to Francis, and I had a fantastic morning here. And what's more, he said he would make sure that I was to visit the British Library map room that afternoon, and he was as good as his word. And off I trotted to the then Bloomsbury site and had a lovely afternoon there. So he worked his magic to persuade Helen Wallace to host me later on that very same day. For me, that visit proved inspirational, yet despite nearing retirement, by the time I ended up working at Sussex University's map library, Peter would regularly telephone to inquire on how things were going, and he was always at the end of a phone line, were I ever in need of advice. In later years, it was always a pleasure to hear his voice or receive an email, and what really struck home was that Peter had become one of those researchers making use of publicly accessible map collections to track down mapping that would at one time have passed through his hands in Tolworth. He never stopped being a true map man.
this was the point at which I was about to close the proceedings, but I've been asked by Peter's family if Anne, his daughter, can say a few words.
I know there have been lots of thanks so far today, but on behalf of the family, and as my father called me his favourite second daughter, something I didn't understand when I was 8, and I looked very forlorn, and he never explained. I had to work it out for myself. But I want to thank everybody who has supported me, a large number of his mapping family, over the last 2 years of his life when he lived with me. And I also especially want to thank Barbara for organising this event, and Yo, and Sarah, and anyone else who I don't know who's involved. You have, between you, portrayed a man I'm afraid we never knew. You don't know how great your parents are, and so we've learned about a man we didn't know, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
And on that note, it is very sadly time to close these proceedings. But before I do so, it would be very remiss of me if I fail to mention that I have received apologies for absence from Joe Smith, Blair White, Jean Smith, Keith Connell, Diana Thornton, Bruce, as many of you knew her, Geraldine Beach, and Jenny Holland. And many of them have asked me to convey their very best wishes to all assembled here today. Like many of you, I have had memories triggered, which I'm not going to go down those roads. But what I would like to say is, first of all, Rita, you had a very, I should say Yo has prompted me to remember that she and I and many here today had a very long queue of people who have repaid through Peter their fellowship. So, because none of us had, the sense to take out life membership, and we're still paying. And it's damned expensive. I kept in touch with Peter from the day I met him, the 1st of September 1964, throughout my career. Like many of you here today, he helped me enormously, but none of us were singled out. That was the sort of chap he was. If you asked, he was very open with his knowledge, his expertise, and his support for all of us who chose the geographic profession. I kept in touch with him in later life simply because I lived in the same part of the world. He lived one side of Exmoor and I lived the other. So my husband and I and Peter and Merle would get together for pub lunches from time to time. And of course we put the world to rights between us, especially the mapping world. But one thing Peter did do was many years before, when I'd been working in the map library under John Patterson, who's here today, Peter, in one of his many active moments of things that needed to be done in the map library, pointed my attention to a very large group of boxes stuck in one of the corners. And he said, Barbara, we need to sort those out. So I said, okay, what are they? And he said, oh, they're just the escape and evasion maps from World War II. But nobody's ever catalogued them, and nobody knows about them because they were never spoken of, and nobody's written about them. And he said, so I would like them done now, if that's okay. Okay, fine. So this is in about the mid-1970s. Peter helped me throughout my career. He always encouraged me. And I like to think that many years later, I was able to repay him back in some small part, because that job he gave me, when I became later, after I'd retired, I became Pro-Chancellor and Chair of the Board of Governors at Plymouth University. I was offered the chance to do my PhD. And what other subject could I choose but MI9, escape and mapping? And so I did my entire thesis on the World War II escape and evasion mapping series. And it was very amusing, certainly to my supervisors, that he took a very close interest in what I was doing and had lots of suggestions. And one of the suggestions he made, kind of about halfway through the progress of the research, was that, well, I was going to include a cartobibliography, wasn't I? Was I? I hadn't even thought about that. He said, well, you have to. You know, he said, it's all very well talking about the history of stuff, but there's got to be a cartobibliography at the end of it. And so, to my supervisor's amazement, I included a really detailed cartobibliography of the 200 and odd escape and evasion maps I'd found, where I'd identified them, who had them. And I did it because I found in my long experience with Peter that when, in those rare moments when he insisted that you did something, rather than simply suggested that you did something, you did it. And I'm sure we've all experienced, or many of us have experienced, Peter suggesting. I suggest that there are a few of us that have experienced him insisting. I know many of you will wish to loiter, catch up with former colleagues as you've been doing so far. But can I ask you please to ensure that this education centre is vacated within the next half hour to allow the RGS staff to prepare it for an evening function. Hopefully you can find corners elsewhere in the society or perhaps at a local hostelry to continue your catch-ups. I thank you all for your attendance. I thank particularly the presenters. Thank you so much. You have really put together the most brilliant resume of the many facets and interests that this very special man had. I'm going to use the mariner's farewell. I wish you all Godspeed, a fair wind, and a safe passage to your next port of call. Thank you.